pass the basket. This is a weekly step meeting with a different speaker each week, speaking on the step of the week, which is step 4, for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, and then open for discussion or questions until 7. So that brings us to our speaker on November 23rd, 2020 in Doylestown, PA, at the Monday night 6 p.m. Stay Alive Literature and Step Group at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And tonight's speaker is Anthony, doing a Step 4 presentation. Please help me welcome him.
It's official. My name is Anthony, I'm an alcoholic. Presenting. I think what qualifies me more to do this talk on a fourth step is that I have had, or maybe suffered would be a better word. I have suffered from the tyranny of constant resentment and anger in my life. Not so much recently, but prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, resentment, fear, and terrible sex conduct was pretty much a way that I just did business. And I didn't really necessarily know that there was another way of living life other than just being constantly resentful, scared to death of everything, and using sex for my own personal gain. And I say those three things specifically. Anybody who's done a fourth step within this room, those are the three areas of our lives that we look at, right? Resentment, fear, and sex conduct. And I know my life in particular, those three areas of my life were absolutely atrocious and terrible to even look at. Terrible in a sense that when I took a look at them for the first time, I really had absolutely no idea how much that stuff really dominated me. And that's what the literature kind of uses, and it suggests that to conclude that other people were quite wrong was as far as I got. And when it really came down to it, the world and its people dominated me within it. And what that meant is that people had power over me all day long. I'd get flipped off in traffic and I'd be chasing a guy down 95 for an extra 20 minutes, right? My fears were just absolutely paralyzing on any given day. If I didn't have a substance in my body, if I didn't have a drink in my body, my being would vibrate to no end. And I literally feared walking out the door on most days and just paying for a pack of smokes at Wawa. Like my head would just grind me up so bad that I'd have this like story of what may or may not happen when I walk into the store to buy a pack of smokes, right? And I couldn't go out of the house without that head just grinding me up. So prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, you could say that drinking did for me what the fourth step did for me in a similar sense. The fourth step for me, I'll backtrack for a second. So drinking did for me, drinking and getting loaded, right? I'm a big fan of high-powered sedatives, and I say that with purpose, right? If anybody's ever read the book, I don't say it jokingly, but if anybody's ever read the book, they're very aware that the book mentions high-powered sedatives on multiple occasions. But I'm an alcoholic through and through. I don't say that lightly either. I'm an alcoholic who's a big fan of high-powered sedatives, and I'm going to leave that there. Alcohol quieted my mind like nothing else did. Like nothing else did. When I was a kid, like we were kind of talking about skateboarding and going to concerts and surfing and like getting in trouble, that did it for a little bit and then it stopped working. Much like alcohol did it for a little bit and then it stopped working. So like when we were kids, we would go around and when I was a kid, I was scared to death of everything. Not necessarily, but I was always scared to death to just go out and hang out. Like once 10th, 11th, 12th grade hit, I was just scared to death of what everybody else was thinking. I was always constantly assuming other people were thinking certain things about me, and I knew what they were thinking about me definitely wasn't going to be a good thing that they were thinking about me, right? My life is characterized by just constant thinking. thinking. And if you're anything like me, I'm not a guy that just sits around and thinks great positive thoughts all day long. That's not what my mind is producing on a daily basis. It's just great positive affirmations. I'm not a great positive thinking guy. It just hasn't been my go-to. So what alcohol did for me after like the skateboarding and the surfing and all that other stuff, because when we were kids, we would go out and we would do that stuff, and I was able to kind of be in communion with other people. I could go be around other people that were into similar things that I was into, right? And we would go, and that stuff would bring me joy. And we would do those things, right? And then that stuff slowly faded out of the picture once alcohol and other stuff kind of faded into the picture, right? Because alcohol was doing for me what that stuff had stopped doing for me. And what it was doing, that's the question. That's the question I had to ask myself coming into Alcoholics Anonymous is, what the hell was alcohol doing for me? What is it that this thing was doing for me that I became willing to sacrifice everything for? I became willing to sacrifice everything in my entire life for the next one, right? And that's the question that I had to ask myself coming into these rooms is, what the hell was that? What was that? I just came off a tear of becoming willing to sacrifice my entire life for the next one. So I say that really just to, I always try to put alcohol in perspective, or alcoholism into perspective into my own life. So I have a better understanding of what I'm up against. Because if I assumed what I'm up against is just trying not to drink and get loaded for today, I'll succumb to that every single time, and I'll just keep getting loaded, and I'll be in that spot. Right, that spot that I'm sure everybody knows and has probably been in here a lot, or has been through many of times, is that spot of getting loaded, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. How did I get to here again? I was just sober for 3 months, and now I'm spun out in the basement again. What the hell is going on? And that state of just absolute confusion that I found myself in on many occasions. So I say all that just to kind of preface some of the stuff that I talk about in the 4-step. So if that clarifies anything, that's great. And the entire 4-step, the entire understanding of the 4-step that I have hinges off of a couple sentences on page 63, or 64, excuse me. So I'm going to use the word ego and self synonymously. So to me, they mean the same thing. Ego and self mean the same thing. And just to further define that, to me, what self is and what ego is an idea of who I think I am, right? And it's completely constructed of thought. So the idea of who I think I am is a thought, right? And that's what we're trying to move away from in the 4-step, is this constant thinking. Because if you're anything like me, what the 2nd step and the 3rd step reveals is that the system that I have relied on my entire life has failed me. Right? The thought, the thinking, the self, the ego, that mechanism that I have relied on has failed me up until this point in time. And that's what we're taking a look at in the 2nd and the 3rd step. And that's if I can become willing, just to say that I become willing to say that this system has failed me, let me try to implement a different one. And this 4-step is just a clarification of the specifics on how the system has failed me. Like in a few different areas, but it's really just, and I'll say this and then I'll get into it. It's kind of like if anybody's ever sat down and did a 4th and a 5th step, and by like the 20th resentment, when I'm the sponsee, I'm like, all right, I get the point. I'm selfish, I'm self-centered, I'm fearful, right? And then I'm on the other side of it, and the sponsee the guy that I'm taking through the 5th step goes, I'm on my 22nd resentment, and then he says the name, the cause, and then before he even tries to go on his 10-minute tangent on why it's justified, he goes right to the 3rd column. Right? That's what the whole point of the repetition is to see how selfish and self-centered I am on every single occasion. So the repetition is purposeful. The repetition is very purposeful. And bringing it back to what I was talking about before, my understanding of this is on page 64, it says, being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us. We considered its common manifestations. So that's what we're looking at in the 4th step. We're looking how self has defeated us. And Bill, when he wrote this, there's some other guys that talk about this with a lot of clarity, and it has allowed me a ton of clarity in understanding this. When Bill Wilson wrote this, I don't even know if he knew what he was doing, but he made a distinction, right? He made a distinction between self and us. So being convinced that self manifested in various ways is what had defeated us, we consider its. So we're considering self's manifestations. This is what we're looking at in the 4th step, is the manifestation of how self has defeated me. And again, just to highlight, I use self and ego synonymously. To me, they mean the exact same thing. The exact same thing. So what I'm looking at in the fourth step is not what I am, it's what I'm not. And this is my understanding of this. I am looking at, through a three-part inventory, what I am not, and how what I am not has taken over what of my life. Or how, excuse me, let me backtrack. How what I am not has taken over my life, right? And how the identification with what I am not has completely paralyzed me, right? So the first thing we look at is we look at resentment. And this is hopefully, let me just give a little bit more clarification, because maybe it's probably, for me, it's a lot more easier to understand when I see a guy who is, and I talked with people on multiple occasions, who is so identified with being the worst person ever, right? Anybody ever identify as being the worst person ever, right? I'm the worst person ever. I can't believe I'm the only person that has done this thing to these people. Nobody else is like as bad as I am. Right? That's how ego takes control of resentment, shame, and self-pity. And then the opposite side of that spectrum is just the guy that thinks he's the best person ever, and he's been on a 6-month meth tear, and his family won't talk to him, and he still has got this idea that he's a great guy. Right? So it's a spectrum. That's all we're looking at here is a spectrum. It's a spectrum of the ego. One side of it is the guy who thinks, or woman, whoever really, who thinks they're the worst person ever, and all these things that I've done are unrepairable. I'm never going to be able to move past this person who I think I am. So that's the one side of the spectrum. And then the other side of the same spectrum is just the person who thinks he's the greatest guy or greatest woman to ever walk the earth. They're the same. It's the same spectrum. They're on the same, or it's two sides of the same coin in my book. We're trying to move past that. We're trying to look at what it is that shows up when both of those things disappear. What it is that's beyond that. What it is that's behind that. Right? There's a couple sayings that I really identified with when I first started kind of understanding some of the mechanics of the fourth step. And one of them was, we are what persists when the thoughts stop. Right? So what it is that I am is what shows up when the thoughts stop. And that's what this fourth step is meant to be, right? It's a clearing away of the wreckage, a clearing away of the worship, a clearing away of the wreckage, the clearing away of the resentment, the fear, the shame and guilt that I have over my sex conduct. And that once that stuff is cleared away, this is the AA philosophy. This isn't my off kilter thing that I think of, and I think of a ton of weird stuff. This isn't one of them, right? AA's philosophy is that once this stuff is removed, God is inherently within me, and it shows up. So this is what this is saying. And that's bringing it back to what we're saying here, is being convinced that self manifested in various ways is what had defeated us. We considered its common manifestations. So once I stop identifying with self, right, I can stop identifying with who I think I am. Once I can stop identifying with who I think I am, I'll be completely free from that. And once I'm completely free from that, I'll be able to rest in that stillness that I know to be God. That stillness and that unknown that I know to be God. That's in a nutshell, that's like the highlights for me of the fourth step. I'll go through the mechanics just because I know they're useful to me. So like I said, the fourth step is characterized by three parts, right? Resentment, fear, sex, and for me, the most important column is the third column for me in the fourth step. Like I said, that's just personally for me. When I was able to understand how the third column operated, I got a clearer picture on how self was operating as a whole in my life. I'll take you through the examples they give us in the book. They seem so far-fetched and so ridiculous to read, but they're such a commonplace thing amongst people that I talk to and do inventory with. I'll go through a more recent resentment that came up and has kind of been working itself through in my own life. So we do 4 columns, right? They only give us 3 columns in the actual example here. The fourth column, for anybody who cares, is on 67 on that third paragraph down, referring to our list again. Maybe we'll get there in a couple of minutes. So a more recent resentment that I have, right? The first column is who or what, like a place, a principle. A principle could be honesty. I'm resentful at honesty because every time I'm honest, it never gets me anywhere. Or I'm resentful at honesty because if I'm going to be honest about the terrible things that I've been doing in life, it's probably not going to do do too much good for me, stuff like that. But the more recent one, like I was saying, coming back to that. So I'm resentful at my employer. I had a more recent resentment towards an employer, and the cause was that they fired me, right? And the second column, the example that they give us is purposeful. I think all this stuff that's done in this book is done with intent and purpose. The cause is one sentence, right? The cause is either one to two sentences maybe they'll give us for each example. And that's done because if you give me an entire notebook to write down the cause of why I'm resentful, I'm damn sure using that entire notebook. So I can explain to you how justified this resentment that I'm about to explain to you is. So the cause, and this is, when I sat down and I did a 4-step initially, it was, I got a little block. I got one of those not notebooks, the Joe and Charlie worksheets. They're great. If anybody wants them, you type in Joe and Charlie first 4-step worksheets. I use them still to this day sometimes. I had a great experience with them when I first used them. But the Joe and Charlie worksheets, the second column on those worksheets is like a 2x2 square. And it's done with purpose, right? Because that's all I need. I need no more. As much as I think I may need more, I remember calling my sponsor, and I'd be like, Larry, the cause box isn't big enough. I'm going to need more room to write this. And he said, no, you don't, man. No, you don't. You only get as much room as they give you, and that's it. I don't want to hear any more than what can fit in that little box. Because when it comes down to it, it really doesn't matter. That's not what we're trying to get to. What we're trying to do is get to that third and fourth column. So the cause, bring it back to the most recent resentment I had. The resentment was towards an employer. The cause was they fired me. And I see, even when I say that out loud, I want to justify it immediately, right? I said they fired me, but I was only working 3 days, and I told them I was going to be working this job for a little bit, and I really was a good employee. And like that's what the ego wants to do. It wants to protect itself at all costs. I can't say out loud I got fired from a job without having to justify it after that sentence. That's what my ego wants to do. It wants to protect itself at all costs. That's what it does all day long. It's trying to protect itself. It's trying to save face all day long. It's a terrible process. Or not terrible. It's a tiring process, I could say, if you keep buying into the kind of smoke screens of it. So the resentment is I got fired, and then affects my. This is the thing that we're trying to get to, right? On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injury. So we're looking at what areas of self were injured. And that's what Bill Wilson and the 4-step examples are trying to describe here in just a more broken down way. So these areas of my life, so self-esteem, security, financial security, emotional security, stuff like that. We can keep breaking these down all day, but these are the 4 bases that I like to stay with. Excuse me. Self-esteem, security, ambitions, personal or sexual relations which had been interfered with or injured. So these are the 4 areas that make up this thing that we call self and make up this thing that we call ego. Right? These are like, if you have ego at the top of this list or self, like I said, they're the same thing in my book. I'm just going to I'm going to use self from here on out because it makes it easier for me. If I have this thing called self at the top of the page, I have these kind of 4 little things underneath it. And they're just the substructures of what makes up this just functional whole of this thing that I call self and we call self. And they call self within the book. So, when any of those areas are hurt or threatened, and that's the thing, is they don't even necessarily need to be actually hurt. They can just be seemingly hurt. Right? Seemingly hurt. So what happens is if one of those areas gets injured, or if you threaten to injure one of those areas, I'm going to get resentful at you. That's what self does just to protect itself. It's trying to protect itself in the only way it really knows how, right? And seemingly the only way it knows how to protect itself is to get resentful. So I get resentful at the boss. The cause, they fire me. What is injured? See, they use the word affects, but what got injured in that instance was my self-esteem. Immediately I think I'm not a good worker. And I had this idea that I'm a great worker. I've been good. I've been nothing but good ever since I've been with this company. I get all the jobs done on time. All the work is crisp. I don't know what the reason behind this thing is. Self-esteem, security, financially, I have absolutely no idea how the hell I'm going to provide for myself now. No idea. Ambitions. I wanted to stay I was in a different field, working, and I had ambitions to kind of further myself within that field. I get fired from a job. Now my ambitions are completely wrecked. I'm like, what the hell am I even doing here? Right? And then my personal relations. I had a couple buddies of mine on the last job I was working on that I was friends with. And then my head immediately goes to, I know they're talking shit behind my back. Right? I know they're talking. I know the day I got fired, that was one of the first things I thought of. It wasn't like, how am I gonna make some money? One of the first things I thought of, man, I bet you those guys are talking about me right now. Right? That's how selfish and self-centered this thing I'm trying to move past is. And when I can finally recognize that that's what it does, I can just let it be a joke that it is. It's just this constant selfish, self-centered thing that's thinking about me all day long. So personal relations are injured. Sexual relations, you can make a case for it, but I'm not. I'm going to leave it alone now, which had been interfered with. So those are the 4 areas of my life. If you threaten them or seemingly threaten them, I'm going to then get resentful, because that's how the ego and self protects itself. What has happened over time, and this hasn't always been the case, but this is a more recent one. This is in like the last year or so. What has happened? So that 5 to 10 minute spiel that I just gave happens in about 30 seconds, right? I get fired, and in the moment, I'm super cool, calm, collected, because I want to put off this image that I'm this super cool, calm, collected guy. And in the moment, I'm like, no big deal, Matt. It's no big deal. I totally understand. And then I walk out the door, and I immediately think about stealing the tile saw that he left out. Right? Immediately. And then I sit in my car, and I just start, grinding. My head just starts grinding on me. Right? And I could get super vulgar about where my head goes, but that would probably serve no purpose. I just get so resentful. And like I said, this happens in about 30 seconds. But just to kind of fast forward, what has happened as a result of practical application of these steps and a continued discipline, you could say, because I'm a super undisciplined guy, or I have the capacity to be super undisciplined. I'm very disciplined these days. I have the capacity to be very undisciplined now. Through diligence and discipline, that happens in about 30 seconds, and then the silence shows up. Right? Silence shows up and says, Anthony, you're going to be all right no matter what. And that's the promise of AA. That's what this has done for me. So practical application of these steps has allowed this process to exist for about 30 seconds these days. Maybe 5 minutes if I'm having a bad day. But then something happens where this faith just comes in, and this is like all the years of just the basics that going to tons of meetings in the early days, not to say that I don't now, but just like the disciplined nature that I had to be in first getting sober and really integrating and making this way of life a part of my own life, right? What being diligent in that process has basically availed me is that when these instances happen, is that AA takes over, right? It just takes over. I don't even do anything. I remember I was sitting in my car at the Lowe's parking lot on 309 in Montgomeryville. I remember I walked out of the shop. I walked out of the shop, and then I had to drive the work truck back over to the parking lot to where I just picked it up from. All the tools in it and everything. That's where the whole tile saw thing came from. It was either like I could steal this truck right now and go scrap it, or maybe I'll just go to a meeting or something like that. Those are the options that still filter through my head. The freedom I have now is just that I can look at them as comical and I can kind of laugh at them. But I remember, like I said, I drove that car over to that Lowe's parking lot, and I sat there. And I remember I put the keys, I turned the truck off. I put the keys on the seat, and then I got out of the car, I got out of the truck, and I got into my own car, and I just sat there. And AA kicked in. And for me, AA is silence. That's what it is. It's freedom from this. It's freedom from this incestuous thinking of, I got to get this guy back. Because what I do well is just revenge, hatred, and shame and guilt. I mean, those are things that I usually typically do pretty well. So when silence kicks in, and this is as a result of just sticking around here and practicing these principles, silence kicks in, and then there's this other thought that shows up that says, Anthony, maybe you have absolutely no idea what's actually going on right now. Because that's been a reoccurring theme in my life, is that I've been taken care of in ways that I have absolutely no idea I could even be taken care of. Right? So there's this other thought that shows up that says, Anthony, maybe you're being taken care of right now and you don't know how you're being taken care of. Right? And that's the faith that when that thought shows up, I say maybe. Right? And then there's that faith in the unknown that I've come to trust with everything that I have in my entire being. Is I trust that unknown with everything I have now. Everything. Because as a result of just doing this day in and day out, I've been taken care of tenfold. Taken care of tenfold. And that's been the case. I mean, that job was taken from me. Another job was given to me in a way that I didn't even know was going to be possible. No idea. But in the moment, what do I want to do? Get resentful. Start thinking about how I'm going to pop this guy's tires. That's still in me. I can still go there. Right? I could still go there. But the freedom is it just passes through. Right? It's just like a fleeting thought. So that's just the resentments. I didn't even really get into fear and sex. I mean, we could sit around here and talk about fear and sex all night, probably. Or I know I can, at least. I don't know. And maybe I'll end with this, because I think the fear is, the fear inventory, at least, is really important to understand, because it's so simple. So on 68, it said we reviews our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. This I always thought was pretty funny. We asked ourselves why we had them, and then it gives us the answer, because it doesn't want us to think about it. Right? It does that for a reason. It doesn't want me to start thinking about why I have these crazy fears and what it is that I grew up with, and I had 3 brothers and a half-twin sister. It doesn't want me to go there. Right? It's purposeful. So we asked ourselves why we had them, period. Then it's going to give us the answer. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Question mark. So the system, right, the system that I take a look at in the resentment inventory in particular, that thing has failed me. So you can call it, for the computer people in here, the operating system, right? The operating system that we have on our computer is not good. A lot of viruses are getting in. Yet I continue to try to use Windows 95 day in and day out. And it's really not working anymore. Right? So there's stupid analogies like that allowed me to put a lot of this stuff into perspective. I put that out for everybody. It's up to you to make sense of your own experience here. And I really truly believe that if you're going to stick around for a long period, you should probably get to know what it is that feels right. Because then you're going to come to a point where a few years ago, I know for me personally, because it happened. I was in AA for a couple years at one point, and I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? Like, what is going on here? It was like a year sober. This place sucks. At a year sober, I'm like, what is going on here? Had absolutely no idea. I was just going to meetings, drinking coffee, getting cookies, super fired up in the fellowship. And then one day I woke up, I was like, this is terrible. Right? And then I went and got loaded, And then when I came back in AA this time, I brought it on myself, or I put it on myself just to figure out what the hell was going on around here. So I started to put my nose in this book and just kind of started making sense. And it was probably one of the most powerful things I've ever done in my entire life. It's just make sense of the experience that has happened to me and that is continuing to happen to me as a result of putting these steps into my life. So it's arguably, like I said, it's on everybody in here to make sense of their own experience. So just to kind of wrap it up, like we asked ourselves why we had them. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Self-reliance was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When he made us cocky, it was worse. So perhaps there is a better way. We think so. We are now on a different basis to trusting, relying upon God. And I'll read these last couple sentences and kind of summarize everything. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. just to the extent that we do as we think he would have us and humbly rely on him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity. So what this is saying is that fear is a result of self-reliance. It's not the other way around. Fear doesn't show up. If I have fear in my life, what that's telling me, like if fear is active in my life, like it was in that 30 seconds after I got fired from that job, what's the fear, right? I'm not going to be able to provide financially. How the hell am I going to get another job? It was like, right as March was kind of setting in, everything was shutting down. Like, what the hell am I going to do? No idea, right? So what's happening in those 30 seconds is self-reliance just trying to come in and fix it, right? Self shows up and says, we got this, man. We're going to figure it out, right? So that's the equation that I'm trying to get to here, is that we asked ourselves why we had the fear. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? So self-reliance has failed me once before, yet I continue to attempt to rely upon it. And as a result of continuing to attempt to rely on self-reliance, I will continue to have fear. But if I can move from a place of relying on that self or ego and move to a place of absolute and total dependence upon God, I will be completely free. And that's been my experience. And that doesn't happen 24/7. That's not like a constant kind of place that I'm at all the time. But I get some really cool glimpses of that. Some really cool glimpses of utter and complete total freedom. And that's been the basis from which I live my life from these days. It's been a flip, right? Prior to coming into AA, I lived my life from a basis of fear, resentment, and absolutely terrible sex conduct. Right? As a result of doing this and continuing to apply the stuff into my life, the basis from which I live my life now is from God reliance. And it's a basis of freedom for me. And to the extent that I can, to the extent that I can not rely on my own self, will be the extent that I experience freedom. And that has probably been one of the truest statements that I've ever come into contact with in and around AA. So that's all I'm probably going to say. I mean, it's important to understand how this thing operates in my mind, because if I don't understand how it operates and I can move away from it, it's just going to keep operating and taking control of the whole system. And then when it does take control, if you're anything like me, it does not seem to do too much of a great job. So trying to rely on something else, God seems to be a better solution. It's been way more peaceful and easy that way. And that's all I got.
So we'll open the meeting up to sharing. Please